So we will talk about the context and the reasons for the study approach, key results and recommendations, and then we'll take questions as Diane described. I want to start by thanking our partners. Our lead funder for this project was NOAA's Office of Habitat Conservation, and very important additional support came from the Boeing Company and the Wildlife Forever Fund. And I also want to acknowledge the partnering organizations that helped make this happen, including ESA, which is Environmental Science Associates, Western Washington University, and the Earth Corps. And in addition to Dr. Crooks and I, there are several other authors of the report that we ought to acknowledge, including Dr. John Ripsick from Western Washington University, Keely O'Connell with Earth Corps, Danielle DeVere from the ESA, and Katrina Pope, also from Western Washington University, and a number of people listed on your screen there who made very important contributions to the work that we carried out. So thank you to everyone, and as with most projects of this sort, it really does take a lot of expertise and a lot of commitment on behalf of a lot of people. So with that, I'm going to talk about what led us to doing this work and how it fits in with our overall efforts. Estuaries, as you probably know, are very important ecosystems globally and in the U.S. They contain many habitat types, including seagrasses, mangroves, salt marsh, and other tidal wetlands. They provide habitat for fish and wildlife. More than 75% of commercial and 80 to 90% of recreational fish species depend on estuaries at some point in their lives. And they also provide habitat for threatened and endangered species. They can buffer storms and protect infrastructure in coastal communities. And they offer tremendous opportunities for outdoor recreation and related tourism. Last year, we released a report documenting the jobs and economic benefits of estuary restoration and learned that investing in restoration creates, on average, about 30 jobs per $1 million invested, which is more than twice as many as the oil and gas and transportation industries combined. As a further example of that, the Galveston Bay Estuary in Texas supports more than 40,000 jobs in recreational and commercial fishing. Next slide, Diane. Thank you. Unfortunately, we are not protecting these places well enough and continue to lose habitat. Historically, we've lost millions of acres of coastal wetlands to agriculture and development, and currently we continue to lose 1 to 3% of these habitats globally and 80,000 acres per year in the U.S. And that U.S. figure is based on the most recent Fish and Wildlife Service status and trends report. And some of those U.S. losses are due to sea level rise and subsidence, but recent increases in the rate of loss are attributable to development pressures. On the flip side, the good news is we know how to bring estuary habitat back to health, and there is a very strong national restoration community made up of scientists, practitioners, advocates, and volunteers from the government, nonprofit, consulting, and academic sectors. And they gather every 2 years, as many of you know, at the Coastal Restoration Summit that is hosted by Restore America's Estuaries and the Coastal Society. However, the current level of investment from both public agencies and private entities is not sufficient to come close to meeting our shared restoration goals. Blue carbon ecosystems, which include seagrasses, salt marsh, mangroves, and other tidal wetlands, remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through carbon sequestration, and they store it in the soils where it can remain for centuries or millennia. Coastal wetlands, on average, store 2 to 5 times more carbon in the soils than forest ecosystems. And that's the main difference between how wetlands remove CO2 from the atmosphere and forests. Forests tend to put it into the trees, into the wood, and wetlands put it into the plants, but ultimately into the soils, which build up over time. The reason we undertook this study was to provide a scientific assessment of the carbon sequestration benefits of estuary restoration at an estuary scale. It is the first of its kind. We're very excited about the results, which you'll hear in just a few minutes. And taken together with the other ecosystem service benefits I spoke about, we believe it becomes very clear and very compelling that as a nation we need to invest now in achieving our estuary wetland restoration and protection goals. So we developed an approach that is fairly straightforward and transferable to other estuary regions. In order to gain this better understanding of the carbon sequestration benefits of restoration. And so the three parts of the approach are first an analysis of the historic, current, and possible future conditions in the estuary. Also, as part of the study, we measured soil carbon and carbon accretion rates at representative sites in the estuary. And then we applied those values and sea level rise estimates to planned and full restoration scenarios that have been developed for that region as well. So with that relatively high-level introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Steve Crooks to take you into more depth in the study. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the main findings of the study. There's a lot more detail in the report, so please go there, and if you have any further questions, do get in touch. We selected, for this analysis, we wanted to look in a region where there's a lot of active restoration ongoing, and really get a sense of what the greenhouse gas implications are of restoring wetlands. And so we selected the Snohomish Estuary, which is one of about a dozen estuaries in the Pacific Northwest within Puget Sound. And it's the second largest estuary in Puget Sound. Above that is the Skagit, and there are a number of other estuaries in the region. And it's fairly typical. It's lost around about 29% of its wetlands. It represents around about 29% of wetland loss for the Puget Sound area. A number of things make wetlands particularly resilient in this part of the world, which makes them of great interest. And here in the Puget Sound area, the whole Puget Sound receives around about 9 million tons of sediment delivered each year from the local catchment. And the Snohomish is no different to that of other estuaries. So it's a very exciting place to look in terms of this kind of assessment. This figure here shows our project boundary. We were working primarily down in the lower estuary, and you see the starred points, which are our sample locations, and I'll provide more detail of those. But our project boundary, we extended upstream, and we included 1 meter of sea level rise on top of the topography to give us a sense of where the estuary will be with future sea level rise. We don't define a time on that, but we define that we recognize that we will get to that elevation at some point in the future. And so we wanted to look at how resilient the wetlands would be with sea level rise and what the distribution would be into the future. Now, historically, what once existed, and in a moment I'll show you a graphic of the historic conditions, what once existed of forested, scrub, shrub, and tidal wetlands, 4,749 hectares of those wetlands, and I'm going to work in metric, if you'll forgive me, and were lost and converted to agricultural or other uses. Now and ongoing are a number of restoration plans, and 1,353 hectares of planned restoration ongoing. The Qualoot project, for instance, which is in the top left-hand corner, is planned for construction this year, and other islands like Spencer and Smith Island are in progress. Here's a view of the historic condition. The sort of blue stipple represents the distribution of forested and scrub shrub wetlands, which represented roughly about 69% of the total estuary at the time, grading gradually down into emergent tidal marshes. And this is very common in most of the estuaries of the Pacific Northwest. Over time, these wetlands were cleared, the forest was cut down, and the soils were drained. At that time, they would release CO2 back to the atmosphere. Unlike many estuaries, which have a distribution of emergent marshes predominantly, the Pacific Northwest did have marshes which built up above marsh plain elevations, and I'll come back to what that means in a little while, and we had more organic soils that were flooded by high tides and by high water as they came down the rivers, leading to wetlands at above marsh plain elevation. And when they were drained, they lost that carbon as well as the carbon that existed at marsh plains. What we hoped to do was try and get a sense of a number of parameters. One, what were the historic emissions that occurred when the lands were drained, when the wetlands were drained? Do we believe or suspect, is there any evidence that emissions may be ongoing? And we weren't able, as part of this project, to do direct measurements of emissions on the existing lands. But what we did do is we looked at the distribution of soils and get a sense of their organic content, which helps us infer whether emissions are still taking place. Now, in the analysis that I'm going to talk about in a little while, we don't include the emissions which will be CO2 from any drained wetlands which are existing on farmland, or where the farmland has been abandoned and water elevations have raised. There'll be methane emissions from ditches and methane emissions from the soils potentially. As we couldn't quantify this, we haven't included in the analysis. But the numbers therefore mean that are provided as part of this report are conservative in that we are not adding to that the emissions that were coming from the existing baseline condition. So the soil distribution, we find there are three major soil formations in this region. The Mekilto, which has around about 20 to 40% organic matter, and that is the sort of pale green color. The Snohomish formation, 10 to 20%, and the Puget Sound formation, 5 to 10%. So dominantly, there are organic soils here. Some are very organic, which would be designated as peats under many definitions. So this system had a wealth of organic soils, and so we infer from this, but we have not quantified, that these soils are likely emitting CO2 continuously as part of a baseline condition. Where soil water elevations are high, we would expect also to find methane emissions as well. This map gives the distribution of planned restoration activities within the project area. And the Kulul project is site number 2, which is about to go into construction, and other projects such as Smith Island there. All of these are planned projects, so these projects are not goals, but are actually in the planning process that money is flowing towards. So these are real projects that we can use for our planning scenarios. And in our future-looking forecast, we looked at these scenarios, and we also looked at what a full estuary restoration would also include. But our analysis was not all theoretical. We based our analysis about some field analysis of the 12 field sites, and this field analysis was developed by Dr. John Ribsig and his wetlands crew at WW University. Soil cores were collected at 3 natural sites, 5 restoring sites, and 4 potential restoration sites, or sites which are still under other land uses right now. Of these cores, 5 were dated using radiometric approaches to get a sense of what the sediment accumulation rate is. So that gives us a sense of how robustly the existing restoration sites, and what I should have mentioned, and I'll come back to, North Eby Island is one example in this estuary where the levees breached naturally during a flood, and the wetland has been restoring on its own over a 40-year period. So we have at that site a record of 40 years worth of wetland accumulation over time. And we have radiometric dating as part of this, which gives us a sense of the rate of sediment accumulation. And from that, we can also use the carbon data to get a sense of rate of carbon sequestration. Great, thank you. And so this graphic here, it shows a number of things, and I'll run through the bottom graphic first. This represents the elevation of each of our sites that we sampled, from natural areas, restoring areas, and possible restoration areas in the future. The elevation is in meters NAVD, so it's an elevation relative to a datum. And the green hatching represents the elevation at which vegetation comes into a site. Vegetation in tidal areas is very sensitive to hydrology. And approximately in this area is the elevation at which emergent vegetation begins transferring from mudflat to vegetated marsh. And this marsh then builds up through time until it reaches what's known as the marsh plain elevation, which tends to be around about mean high water, or if you're in another part of the country, mean high water springs. And we see, for instance, here that two sites, Heron Point and Otter Island, have built up right to that elevation there. The Quilleceda Marsh is still building towards that elevation, and that our other sites are lower than that. And that reflects that when these wetlands were drained, the soil subsided. Part of that is carbon emission, part of it is water loss, and the soil drops in elevation. But in this particular estuary, most of the estuary is within the elevation at which vegetation would come back in again. Here is our North Eby Island site, which has been accreting for 40 years and is well within the vegetation colonization range. And in this island, Spencer Island, which I'll come to as well, and then Smith Island are restoring sites. Spencer Island is within the vegetation range. Smith Island is just approaching it. So taking us to the top figure, here we have direct measurements from radiometric dating provided by John's group, which show us the rate of carbon, which shows the rate of soil buildup in each area. Heron Point and Otter Island are both within natural marsh plain elevations and are gradually building up. Spencer Island is a recently restored site, 5 years old, and that's building up at 3 millimeters per year, which is a good healthy rate. It's above that, just above that for the rate of sea level rise. But North Eby Island, which has been building up at a constant rate at the location where we sampled of over 1 centimeter per year. And that is consistent with a previous study that was done 10 years ago, which documented around about 1 centimeter per year of marsh building at a constant rate over the last 40 years. And so this is very encouraging. It gives us a sense that in this area, because of both the combination of high sediment availability, but also because of the species which are present, there is good restoration potential in these systems. The species are bulrushes, which are common along much of the west coast in fresh to brackish settings. And the reason they're particularly resilient is they put down rhizomes, which are pretty effective at building organic soils. When you look at the rate of carbon accumulation being measured, the high marshes are accumulating carbon at somewhere between 60 grams of carbon per meter squared per year, or 173, up to 173 grams of carbon per meter squared per year, which equates roughly to, if you average the two, to 1 gram per meter squared per year, or 1 ton per hectare, or 4 tons, just under 4 tons per hectare of CO2 per year. North Eby Island, because it's building faster, is actually sequestering carbon at a higher rate, which is roughly 4 tons of CO2 per year, or roughly, 4 tons of carbon, or 4 tons of CO2 per hectare per year on the restoration side. So that's very promising. And this is what carbon density data looks like. It's you combine bulk density with organic carbon content, and you get this key parameter of carbon density, and you measure it through the soil column. Most marshes have a carbon density somewhere between 0.02 to 0.04 grams per centimeter cubed. There are a few marshes outside of that range, but dominantly they're within that range. And so what we're seeing here of carbon densities around about 0.025 are very typical for many marshes in many parts of the world. In this case, this marsh has been building up for 40 centimeters. It's built up 40 centimeters over 40 years, and this is the profile here. Here's Spencer Island. This is the former breach surface, the former agricultural surface here, and this has been building up sediments also at a similar kind of rate. Now, to determine the emissions which have been have resulted historically, but also to determine the sequestration into the future, we took what's known as a hypsometric approach. It's a common approach used by geomorphologists. And basically what you look at is the existing topography in reference to either area distribution or to volume distribution. And so this line here, we'll look at the area distribution, shows the topography of the site. So around about 1,000 hectares of the site are at elevations below 1 meter. And that roughly represents the colonization elevation of the vegetation. And then 4,000 hectares of the site fall at this elevation below marsh plain. And then with sea level rise, that area will extend. And with 1 meter of sea level rise, we'll have over 5,000 hectares of the site below that marsh plain elevation. And so what we can determine here, looking forward, is the amount of carbon that would be accumulated. Actually, I'll turn to the volume curve that would fill. If we know the carbon density, we can calculate the amount of carbon that would accumulate within the space that's filled by rebuilding marshes. Historically, there were 1.7 million tons of carbon, that's carbon not CO2, released from these soils, but more so from the above ground biomass, the forests, 2.8 million tons of biomass, of carbon from biomass were released when the forests were cut down. Now I'm going to give you the key results. There's a lot more detail and color in the main report, so I would direct you there. But the key results to overlook are that for the existing projects, planned restoration projects, building back up, we would expect to yield and gain around about 1.1 million tons of CO2 as these marshes build back up to sea level, back up to marsh plain elevation. Now we're relatively confident in that number because the observed rates of accretion on EB Island are in excess of that of natural sea level rates. So it's a very promising result. Planned restorations, if you add on the 1 meter of sea level rise, would accumulate an additional 1.4 million tons of CO2 into the future. Now we don't know the timeline of that, but we do know that when the marshes build up, it will eventually get to that level. Total CO2 sequestered under the existing planned restoration project are of the order of 2.5 million tons of CO2. Now, for those of us who don't work on soils all the time, in terms of maybe an equivalent emission, that would be equivalent to 1 year's worth of cars driving around of 500,000, or 5,000 cars driving around for 100 years. If we would expand the restoration to include the rest of the estuary, then we can expand the analysis again using the carbon density numbers and the volumetric approach. Full restoration of 4,393 hectares would yield a total of just under 4.5 million tons of CO2. Full restoration with sea level rise would yield an additional 4.4 million tons, yielding CO2 sequestration of 8.9 million tons overall. Now this is equivalent to emissions of around about 1.76 million cars in 1 year, or around about 17,600 cars driving around each year for 100 years. So as part of that analysis, we also included the methane emissions to get a sense of how much would it still be a net negative project overall. And we included that, and the details are in the report. It roughly brings down the net GHG sequestration by about a factor of 50%, so it's still very much a very positive project. But when you also account, when it's possible to account for the baseline condition, that would bring back up the sequestration rate again. So here we're providing the carbon numbers. In the main report, we also provide the methane numbers to go with that for the with project condition. Now the key results in the project is the emergent restoration projects in Snohomish are very resilient to sea level rise. However, what we should also add is that it is beneficial to restore these wetlands now while the elevations are at or close to the vegetation colonization elevation. Doing so allows a period of time for the vegetation to establish and for marsh building to take place. The approaches, as Steve mentioned earlier on, that are being developed within this study are transferable and it provides an approach where you could look at other estuaries in other parts of the country to assess what the restoration opportunities are. Each part of the country will have a different opportunity. They will have different species. They will have different sensitivity to sediment availability. So it's important to look in different parts of the country and see what those opportunities are. But the approach developed here would be transferable to other systems. In terms of limitations and assumptions, I'll come back to that. While we use default values for the emergent marshes, it would be beneficial to have actual monitoring take place within these sites. We have a relative degree of confidence within the emissions factor that we adopted from the IPCC recent guidance. The number that we use is very similar to a number that's been measured in California for managed wetlands with similar species. But real numbers, actual numbers collected on site would greatly improve the resolution and reduce the error bars of that analysis. Equally, we would recommend that methane and nitrous oxide be quantified in the baseline condition on the existing drained agricultural soils. As much as possible, we've tried to be conservative in our analysis, so erring on the side of caution in the numbers that we've developed and in the numbers we use in the report. And so the main conclusions is that the project demonstrates robust recovery. Existing projects demonstrate robust recovery of wetlands, and this is transferable to what we might see in other parts of Puget Sound. They have a very high capacity to respond to rates of sea level rise, and this illustrates the climate change mitigation benefits of tidal wetlands restoration and conservation. Each coastal region is going to be different and hold different opportunities as well as different constraints. There's a need to look at each coastal region of the U.S. and provide guidance on restoration and protection actions that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions and provide for future climate change adaptation and create other ecosystem services, economic benefits, including jobs. This work supports carbon project development and will become possible with approval of the global tidal wetlands restoration methodology that Restore America's Estuaries have submitted to the verified carbon standards. It also provides an approach to support state and national GHG accounting for wetlands management and as called under the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. And with that, I'll hand it back to Steve.
Thank you. Am I on?
Yes, but you're a little bit quiet. If you could speak up, Steve.
Thank you, I will. Thank you, Steve, for that, I think, very clear presentation of the study. I wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about some recommendations for how to use this work going forward and how to expand upon the results that you've just heard. So for the Pacific Northwest region where this study took place, we would recommend that there be a regional blue carbon working group established to inform science and planning activities. And along those lines, we and some other partners, including NOAA and the Fish and Wildlife Service, have been leading blue carbon managers workshops for Oregon and Washington, and through those hope to develop additional local capacity around blue carbon. Secondly, we would advise an expansion of the scope of this work to other estuaries within Puget Sound, and so we can find out what the blue carbon benefits of restoration would be in those areas compared to the Snohomish, and learn more about the various things that would influence that. Third, as Steve mentioned, the study did not assess current emissions in the landscape from methane, nitrous oxide, or carbon dioxide, or potential emissions that could occur with restoration, and that would primarily be methane, but might also be nitrous oxide. And so having this picture, it would be a more complete picture of the overall net greenhouse gas benefits of estuary restoration. Fourth, identifying and developing pilot projects would help to demonstrate how carbon finance or other incentives can help move restoration forward in the region. And one way to do this would be to use the greenhouse gas methodology for tidal wetland and seagrass restoration that we have just submitted to the verified carbon standard for approval. The public review for that will begin in just a week, actually. And for those of you on the call, we'll make sure you receive notification of that. And then fifth is to scale up our investment in restoration and protection in these important ecosystems. Taken with the other ecosystem services, as I've said before, it's really more clear than ever how much we human beings depend on estuaries. And it is time to make a high-level commitment to meeting our estuary restoration goals. At the national level, we also have a series of recommendations on the next slide. Thank you. And some of them are in parallel with the regional recommendations. So the first thing would be to establish a national blue carbon working group. And we'll be working with NOAA and other partners to begin that process in just the next couple of months. And secondly, additional research and analysis of greenhouse gases in estuary wetlands, but particularly connecting it to management options would be a valuable step to take so that coastal land managers can understand any available options or benefits or downsides of specific management actions they might take. As Steve mentioned earlier, this approach is transferable, and every estuary is different. And so to carry this approach out in other estuaries would give us a much better understanding of greenhouse gases in other regions and overall, and really help move this forward. To assist reporting on greenhouse gases under the new IPCC guidelines, they are calling for participating countries to begin looking at wetland emissions and reductions in greenhouse gases. And that's something that this work supports, and we can assist going forward. Number 5, integrating climate mitigation, adaptation, and restoration actions at the local level. So restoration and conservation efforts should be coupled together going forward to ensure long-term survival of wetlands as sea levels rise. And now we know that restoration can have significant climate mitigation benefits as well. So linking these three things together should provide tremendous benefits going forward. For the same reasons, we recommend pilot projects for the Pacific Northwest. We also recommend them in other places in the U.S., again, to demonstrate how blue carbon projects can work in specific landscapes. Number 7, Duke's Nicholas Institute and NOAA have been exploring options for integrating blue carbon considerations into existing statutes, regulations, and policies. These could include, for example, NEPA analyses, the Natural Resources Damage Assessments that occur, and Clean Water Act permitting reviews and requirements. And I think further work in that area would be very beneficial and could help in the long run towards protecting and restoring these ecosystems. And then last, consistent with our mission and our goal of pursuing the blue carbon work, we are calling for increased investment, both public and private, in estuary wetland restoration and protection, because we know without a doubt the tremendous services and values that they provide to us. And I will stop there, and I believe we will shift to questions at this point. And thank you again for your attention today.
Well, thank you so much, Steve and Steve. This has been really, really great for you to both give us an overview of blue carbon, really walk us through the report results, and now to start thinking about some of the opportunities moving forward. You know, I think just from my own perspective, forest carbon has long had the recognition, forests, you know, for their climate mitigation benefits and their ability to sequester carbon. And this research is really what it's going to take in order to get us to that same place with coastal tidal wetlands. So thank you both. So in addition to Environmental Science Associates and Restore America's Estuaries, I want to again thank Earth Corps and Western Washington University for their direct contribution on and leadership in this report, and also NOAA's Office of Habitat Conservation, the Boeing Company, and Wildlife Forever Funds, who helped provide the funding that made this possible. So I'd like to open this discussion up to everyone who's on the phone. You have two options. One would be to submit a question through the question box, or to raise your virtual hand. That will allow me to see that you have a question and unmute your line. I've got a queue of questions that are building up here in the question box, so I'll start with Robert O'Sullivan. His question is, would any of the accumulation be lost to when the sea level rises, i.e. the submerged carbon subsequently lost after it becomes permanently underwater? Steve Crooks, I think.
Yes, I'll take that one. Thank you, Bob, and thanks very much for joining us. Nice to see you again. Yes, it's a good question. If the carbon is submerged, then it largely stays in place. It stays in place, and as these marshes build up, buried carbon accumulates within the soils, and the more concentrated stuff will stay there. The question then becomes, well, how do these wetlands respond to sea level rise? Most wetlands migrate landwards with sea level rise. What was interesting about this particular setting is that the wetlands look particularly robust to staying in the same location. They can build relatively rapidly because of the sediment supply, but also because of the type of vegetation. And so there's quite likely the chance that these wetlands will stay in the same location and migrate backwards at the back end with sea level rise, so the forend will stay in the same geographical location. Speaking more generally, though, the question becomes for tidal wetlands, what happens if sea level rises at a rate greater than they can sustain? And whereas in this case, the very high sustainability, the high resilience of sea level rise, in other locations, if they can't migrate, then they drown out. In that case, then ongoing sequestration halts at that time. What happens to the sediment if it's redistributed? Well, that's a good question, and it reflects, the best thinking right now is that it reflects the geomorphic setting. If you're in, say, the Mississippi Delta, and a storm comes through, maybe a hurricane once every 50 years in a certain location, that carbon which builds up in the soils will be redistributed. It will pass through the water column, but be rapidly buried again on the adjacent mudflat. So most of that material will be reburied again. It's now redistributed across the wider landscape, and that, in fact, is the origin of many oils and deltaic systems. But the cases where that wouldn't happen would be situations where you have something like a sediment-deficient system and a carbonate shelf, where the sediment is redistributed and then it lies on an open rock surface, and in that case would be oxidized and returned back to the atmosphere. But most of the coastal systems around the U.S. are sandy or sediment-dominated, and we'd expect most of the carbon just to be reburied again within adjacent sediments.
Thank you. We've got a great question from Roanne Petrell. Her question was, have the private residences and farmers embraced wetland restoration around their properties within the Washington region?
I'm not a great expert of the politics of Washington region, except they are doing an awful lot of great practice in terms of wetlands restoration. In most communities, it's a mixed feeling. Some landowners are encouraging to see more wetlands restoration, either because they do want to move on their land, or they want to do an environmental benefit and keep the land for themselves. In other settings, it's something where farmers would rather prioritize other activities. And most coastal settings, really what we hope to see is a rich mosaic of healthy communities which incorporate a level of restoration, but also incorporate a level of good farming practices. What we're hoping to do here is just make aware to people what the greenhouse gas implications are of wetlands management. And then, and also looking at whether there is potential to use carbon financing or other mechanisms, open up new opportunities to those landowners. And so we'll see what bubbles up in the future, but as we say in the Snohomish, already around about 25% of the estuary has undergone some form of planning towards wetlands restoration. that may be the end of it, or maybe new landowners will be interested in exploring options for more wetlands restoration.
Our next question comes from Mark. He's interested in, you mentioned constructed wetlands in California having similar results, and he's curious if these results are published.
A good question. Some of the results are published. You can look to the work of people like Steve Deverell, who I imagine is right on this call, but also there was papers by Robin. Oh, sorry, Robin, I forget your name. But I'll have a brainstorm there. But there were a number of papers that have come out of the managed wetlands folks, USGS, and Department of Water Resources in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. And so we can connect you to those papers. I know there are also additional studies which have been ongoing. There are actually additional studies also produced on the greenhouse gas accounting out of Berkeley University and by Dennis Baldocci's group. There's also ongoing studies that have also taken place which have not yet been published by the USGS, which have been looking at greenhouse gas emissions on that site and on adjacent sites, farmland, which are yet to be published. And that work has been undertaken by Lisa Marie Wyndham-Myers. So I would push you on to those authors, and if you want additional follow-up information, I'd be very happy to provide that.
And his follow-up question was, have there been any similar studies of carbon related to nearshore kelp marine forests?
Interesting question. Not in the U.S. that I'm aware, but in South Korea and across Asia, there is more interest in that. The interesting thing about kelp, or how it fits into the blue carbon paradigm, is primarily for blue carbon, we're looking to accumulate organic matter within ground, within soils. Kelps are different to that. They normally exist on rocky substrates, and the biomass is largely, like terrestrial forests, is largely in the above ground biomass. So the Koreans are looking at this, but my suspicion about how the numbers will play out is that the numbers are not that great. We're really looking for soil accumulation. Where the kelp might be interesting is in kelp harvesting. If kelp becomes something like a biofuel, a substitute for a biofuel, it may be more valuable in terms of a renewable resource that could be farmed, rather than building up a single carbon stock kelp forest. Maybe it's more of a biofuel issue. But you can always do the accounting for the expansive kelp forest and see what the carbon value is of conserving any of those kelp forests at risk.
Our next question is from Doug Myers. Is Qulote, thank you. Is it preparing itself as a carbon offset project, given that you have the necessary data to establish a baseline?
No, and I expect, no. Steve may chip in and talk about the additionality question in a second. But largely projects which have been planned already would not be recognized as carbon projects. The idea of the carbon financing is that it provides an additional incentive for new projects to come online. However, the value of the project, the Qulote project, could be recognized by the project partners and by the community because it will have net carbon benefits, net greenhouse gas reduction benefits. And so this is something that could be recognized as a benefit, an additional ecosystem service along with everything else. But it would not be eligible for carbon financing because it's already in progress.
From Eric Swenson, what plants are you using other than bulrushes?
In this system, we're not using plants specifically. It's the natural flora in the region. And the species which are dominant here include Carex lingbai and this bulrush. And they happen to be both pretty prolific in building soil carbon. When you get down into California, other bulrushes are present which are equally prolific. And so to look around the states, you would look to see what the local native species would be and how they fit into this carbon accumulation rate. Not all marshes have a high carbon accumulation rate. In San Francisco Bay, pickleweed, it does produce root matter, but it's not in the volumes that we would see in situations where further up the estuary in San Francisco Estuary, where you get into bulrushes, that you find these kind of carbon accumulation rates.
Our next question is from Kristen Wilson. In the volumetric approach, how do you deal with spatial variability in carbon densities? Do you average over the entire study region?
Another good question. At this level, we were providing a scoping level assessment of what the potential numbers would be. If you were getting into a more detailed project, then you would have to, what they say is stratify the landscape. You look to the variability across the landscape. Here we stratified to some degree. We sampled where there were forested wetlands, where there were scrub shrub wetlands, and where there were emergent wetlands. But when it came to the restoration sites, we're primarily looking at emergent wetlands again, and our sampling reflected that. If, however, you had another system, you would stratify again based upon the different types of ecosystems that you might find, and you would also subsample within each of those ecosystems to get a sense of the variability. Interestingly, work done by John Calloway in San Francisco Estuary, where he sampled across a number of marshes that were natural marshes, not restoring marshes, found very little variability from one site to another, which might suggest that the amount of variability in carbon accumulation is not that great. But for every new study, every new region that you go into, you really will have to go through the work of stratifying the landscape and determining the number of carbon samples that would be required. Any questions for Steve?
Sorry, Steve, I may have skipped you on one of the questions. Did you have something to add?
Well, going back to Doug Meyer's question and Steve Crooks' comment on additionality, just for those who don't have an understanding of carbon offsets yet, offsets are intended to be an offset or balance to new emissions or decrease sort of our net emissions. And so to the extent that something is already going to happen, giving that an offset credit would not be consistent with that goal. So as Steve was saying, and that concept is called additionality. And as Steve was saying, projects that are already underway, it would be hard to argue that they are additional and should receive credits. But for projects still in planning that need additional support or funding, those are cases where it would be proper or appropriate to consider offsets.
Thank you. A question from Laura Brophy. Can we expect mineral sedimentation rates to scale proportionately across an entire estuary given available total sediment loads for the river system? Or is it possible a single restoring site in a diked landscape might receive a disproportionate load compared to a similar acreage within a fully restored estuary with no dikes remaining?
Hi, Laura. Thanks for that question. Good question. Sediment distribution is quite variable, of course. You may find within a single marsh, sandy levees and nearby more organic soils. When we look at the Snohomish, you can see within the historic soil map the variability in the distribution of organic and mineral soils, and that reflects the variability across the estuarine landscape. So what I would also add is that when you think about sediment availability, you're kind of looking to get a sense of how the wetlands are going to respond to sea level rise. The more mineral sediment available, the more resilient those wetlands will be. Equally, you're looking to the vigor of the plants. Bulrushes are particularly resilient. Other species are fairly resilient, such as spartinas on the east coast. And you're looking to get a sense of both of those. There's largely a threshold. You need a certain amount of mineral sediment available, and then if there's above that threshold, the variability can be considerable, and the marsh will respond in the same way. So if we were to take your question and extrapolate it a little bit, and you want to look in other parts of the country, you might want to look at different management approaches when thinking about your restoration activities and how that affects your carbon budget. So while here in the Pacific Northwest, we're seeing very resilient marsh building and potentially very resilient response to sea level rise, if you were in somewhere, let's say Florida, which does not get much sediment supply in most of the coastline, you would have to look to different restoration practices to balance your mitigation and adaptation strategies. So if you went, say, somewhere like Tampa Bay or anywhere else along the coastline, what you're really looking to do there would be to be creating space for wetlands to move into. And so, new seagrasses will come along with silverized, but you need space for the mangroves to move into. This kind of thinking about the sediment supply would be a moot point in most parts of Florida. It's a different strategy.
So we've just got a couple more minutes remaining, so I'm going to try to group a few of these. These two are, have you considered eelgrass meadows, and if so, how would you measure carbon accumulation? Also, have you taken into account warmer water temperature and the change in species migrating north? Two different questions, but
two linked questions, good questions. Eelgrass, we didn't consider eelgrass in this study. There are a number of people working on carbon accumulation within seagrasses. There was a paper published in Nature last year by James Forkran et al. From Florida International University, summarizing the global state of the science with relations to carbon accumulation by seagrasses. And in the methodology that Restore America's Estuaries have submitted to the Verified Carbon Standards for review, we include the potential for seagrass projects to fall under that methodology. So that's very promising. Here in the Snohomish, there weren't any eelgrasses to really consider, at least within the region that we were working in. But in other situations, other settings, Florida, Chesapeake Bay, the Salish Sea to the north of this site, they may be more important parts of the carbon cycle that should be included in analysis. The second question was?
Related to water temperatures and change in species migrating north.
That's a good question. We didn't look at that, and that is also something that is definitely worth considering. Here, this particular species goes considerably further south along the Oregon coastline and into Washington, into California, and so we weren't at the end of a range here for this particular species. In other parts of the country, you will certainly want to look into whether you're at a threshold for any given species, and consider that as part of your planning, or your feasibility assessment, or your vulnerability assessment.
A question from Tori Luding from ICF International. How do tidal mudflats compare to marshes in terms of carbon sequestration potential?
Now, tidal mudflats do accumulate carbon, but primarily when we're thinking about blue carbon systems, we focus on emergent vegetated wetlands, or we focus on vegetated wetlands. Seagrasses, of course, are not emergent. And the reason for that is there's a direct route that you can point to where CO2 is extracted from the atmosphere, or in the case of seagrass, is extracted directly from the water column and transferred and deposited within soil. And so you can account for that, what's called autochthonous carbon sequestration, or on-site carbon sequestration. Mudflats do not sequester CO2 directly through that route through the plant. And so while they do sequester carbon, or they do hold carbon that is accumulated from other sources, such as coming down river deltas and being buried within the mudflat as a final point of deposition, we don't tend to focus on that because there's a concern that we might be double counting the carbon which has been accounted for somewhere else in the landscape. So we focus on the vegetated wetlands where the carbon accounting is clearer. Down the line, there may be new science which can expand on that question, but for now, we focused on that direct autochthonous carbon accumulation.
So our final question call comes from Paul Stacy. He says, has anyone looked at the marsh vertical accretion and potential higher exposure to erosion and slumping, a result of the increasing depth differential of adjacent open water, which would likely accrete at a much lower rate? Would that lead to area losses and less sequestration than estimated from sea level rise?
Another good question. Really, when you look at these studies, you've got to take the geomorphic context. You've got to take the geomorphology in context. And so, yes, there have been a number of studies which have looked at marshes in different settings. Some marshes, for instance, such as Elkhorn Slough, are eroding now and will be losing carbon resources as part of that process. In other estuaries, they will respond differently to sea level rise. If you understand the geomorphic context of each marsh or each estuary, then you can get a sense of how these systems will respond to sea level rise, and then factor that in to your planning for carbon accounting as well as adaptation planning. So I think, yes, it's a good question, very good question, but the important message is understand the geomorphic context and then put your planning and accounting within that geomorphic context as you think forward with sea level rise and other activities.
Well, with just 30 seconds remaining, our time is coming to a close. I want to thank you all for participating. The recording of today's session will be posted on our website, and I will share a link to all participants and registrants. We apologize for anyone who wasn't able to get in, as our participation was limited to 100. The report is very encouraging, and it's a critical step towards increasing the global recognition that restoration of coastal wetlands can have a significant climate greenhouse gas reduction mitigation benefits. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.